We are making pretty good progress on the rear frame and suspension overhaul that we're doing on the UglyTruck. And the whole point of this exercise is to make a truck that is somewhat streetable and comfortable, but will also stick to the ground well enough to run a quarter-mile pass somewhere in the 8-second zone. That's like my final ultimate goal for this truck, to run 8s while still being somewhat comfortable and daily drivable. And so basically I don't want a stripped out race truck. I want something that is sorta kinda streetable. Of course it's not gonna be a daily driver, but I still want to have some of those creature comforts. So like, let's say I want to do a drag week or a Rocky Mountain race week type of situation, which if this year works out, maybe we will, we still have some semblance of a street vehicle. Now, in terms of power, yeah, that is a pretty lofty goal, but we have in the works right now a 547 cubic inch Gen 7 big block, and we're actually waiting on a second set of custom pistons. I did order one set of custom pistons, but we're changing the bore size a little bit, and we're going with a stronger design of piston. So the way parts is going lately, that's kind of a major delay. But the short version is we should have enough power to get the truck into the 8s. Our goal is somewhere around 1,500 horsepower, which is probably gonna be one of the most powerful Gen 7 big blocks on the planet. I know there's a couple up there. There's one I know of in a boat that's right at 1,500, and there's one that's going in a really cool lime green Fox body Mustang that's probably going to have me beat. But definitely we're going to be in like the top 3 or top 5 Gen 7 big blocks, I think, on the planet, dare I say it. I don't know, that's a little ways off. We have some ambitious goals there, but I want to make about 1,500 horsepower, which is what I need to get this big, heavy, giant truck into the 8s in the quarter mile. Anyway, we're kind of talking about rear suspension, and I've got sidetracked a little bit. So today the goal is to get the truck with the tires on it kind of sitting on its own weight. To do that, we got to get the spring hangers bolted on, the fuel tank back up in. We need most of the work is going to have to do with the axle. So I need to get the spring purchase welded on, set the pinion angle, get the shock mounts welded on. And then of course, probably the biggest pain in the butt, those leaf springs, we need to swap out the front rubber bushing for the Caltracs aluminum sleeve. And then once we do that, we get everything kind of under the truck. I don't think it'll be, the rear suspension project will be like done today, because there's a few other tweaks that I want to do to this axle housing. I'm probably going to weld the tubes into the center section. I don't know how long this 8.610 bolt is going to last. I do know that, like the guys from On the Gas Racing down in Texas, they've put a full-size Silverado, a single cab, into the 7s on a stock 8.610 bolt axle housing. That's a lot to ask of it, and who knows with the amount of torque that this truck is going to be making. At 1,500 horsepower, I have no idea how much torque it's going to be making, but I can tell you it's going to be a lot. So anyway, the whole version of that is, I don't know if this is going to be the final axle housing. I've considered upgrading to like a 49-inch. That's kind of like the gold standard, or also a 9.5-inch 14-bolt semi-floater. That would be a direct conversion. We don't have ABS to worry about on the back end of this truck. This year didn't have wheel speed sensors. But anyway, that's like long-term goals. We're talking short-term goals. We just need to get this truck put back together. So let's get to work. So starting at the very beginning, we have the original spring hangers now bolted back onto the frame. I am using a 1/2 inch hardware instead of the rivets that originally held them on, because obviously there's no good way to reinstall those factory rivets. But because we're using a larger 1/2 inch fastener than what the rivet is, I know this is plenty strong. This hardware is actually left over from a Beltec bolt-in C-notch, and I never bolt those in. I always kind of weld them because I figured that's stronger. But this is good hardware to save. It's, like I said, grade 8 fine thread, and it has these flange nuts, which are nice, and it also is a prevailing torque nut, which means it's like kind of crimped, and so it bites into the bolt so nothing will back out. And on top of that, I installed some of that orange, it's thread locker. It's high strength thread locker, but it also is removable, so whatever. Anyway, the point is those bolts aren't going anywhere, and the spring hanger is firmly mounted to the chassis of the truck. As far as the leaf spring goes, I did actually remove the overload spring, which I don't really need the trailer carrying capacity because I'm never going to haul a trailer with this thing. And it's also important because the Caltracs need a somewhat soft spring to be able to work against, because the whole way that they do work is they actually put pressure down on the leaf spring, which kind of drives the tire into the pavement, which improves traction. Normally on these trucks, obviously the spring sits on top, but we now have it down on the bottom. That's a spring under. That's where we're getting our 6 inches of drop from. And the center bolt right there, I had to flip that upside down. Now the nut is on the bottom, and the Caltrac bracket is going to kind of go like that. And that's what the linkage attaches to, that eventually will come up here to the belt crank. Let's see, I did have to enlarge the hole in the little Caltrac spring perch. Not a big deal, it'll sit right there, and I have the axle cleaned up, ready to weld the perch on. So from here on out, basically what I've got to do is swap the bushing on the other leaf spring. That can be a bit of a pain. I've got an inexpensive like Harbor Freight shop press kind of there behind the ladder, and it'll do the job actually without a whole lot of effort. So one thing I do is I take just a punch and a chisel, or a chisel and a hammer, and I kind of flare out one end of this so I can actually get a little block or something on the other side of the leaf spring, and then just use the press to push those out. You might be able to get this out with a hammer. I know some guys have used like a ball joint press, like the C-clamp looking thing, but basically you've got to get the bushing out as well as the metal sleeve so you can replace it with the Caltrac aluminum sleeve, and steel bushing. When you do go to put these in, it's important that you don't hit these in with a hammer and put some sort of grease on there or anti-seize or whatever. If you do smash that in with a hammer, it will deform, and then the steel insert will not fit in nice and tight like it should. So I'll get that swapped out real quick. I'll get the leaf spring back on that side of the truck. And then all I got to do is figure out a way to I'll probably just bolt the leaf springs in with the U-bolts and put the truck on the ground. Then we can set the pinion angle, then we can weld it all in. So before I got the axle perches welded on, I gave Calvert Racing a call real quick. They're the people that actually make the Caltracs. And I just wanted to clarify a few things about the pinion angle, because I have a 2-piece drive shaft on this truck, which does complicate things just a little bit, but it's not a huge deal. Although, as I was talking to them, I asked a question about some shock travel, and I realized I'm gonna have to redo a few things on the frame. So I'll get to that in just a second, but first let's talk about pinion angle. They recommend a -2 to -4 degree pinion angle as compared to the transmission output. And the reason they do that is so under acceleration, whenever the pinion climbs up, basically it'll be parallel. So if you're at -3 degrees at static, under acceleration, the pinion is going to want to climb up. And in theory, that 3 degrees will become now parallel with the transmission. Just kind of use 0 degrees for an example. The problem is, like I said, I have a 2-piece drive line, and basically what they recommended, if I understood it properly, is just treat the front shaft as you would the transmission and have the pinion point down between 2 and 4 degrees from the front shaft. Once again, so under acceleration, the pinion is going to climb up and you'll have a parallel angle between the front shaft and the differential. I ended up with 2.4 degrees, and kind of their suggestion there was stay closer to 2 degrees if you have a mainly street vehicle, and you go all the way up to 3 or 4 if you have a dedicated drag setup. And I kind of wound up at 2.4 just because I figure I'll still be driving this thing on the street, and I kind of want, you know, to minimize high-speed vibrations and stuff like that. I probably should have gone closer to 3, but I figure at this point a half a degree probably won't make a huge difference, although I could be wrong. If we have to fine tune this later on, either you can cut the perches off and re-weld them, which is a pain, or you can just buy a shim to go in there and actually roll the pinion up or down according to where you need it. So anyway, the one thing I realized after talking to those guys about the shocks is I'm going to have to redo my upper shock mounts. And here's why. So on a Caltracs setup, they suggest a minimum of 2 inches of compression on the shock and a minimum of 4 inches of extension. And basically, the reason for that is whenever you're doing a launch, the rear end is going to separate. It's going to be pushed away from the chassis. So they want to have more length on the shock to extend than they do to compress. The problem though is the shocks that I installed on here, because I ordered 2 sets from Atomic. I ordered one for this truck and I ordered one for the step side. The step side was going to be a little bit higher, and I probably messed up the measurements that I took. But anyway, the shock that was intended for this UglyTruck only has 4 inches of available travel. So if I set it up with, like, say 1 inch of shaft exposed, I'd only have 1 inch of compression. So if I go over a bump, you know, I think I could fairly easily bottom those out, and that only leaves 3 inches of extension. And if we get this truck to launch really, really well with a good sticky tire, and say it separates a little bit more than the 3 inches that would be left on the shock, once it tops out, it's going to upset the chassis and it'll cause it to lose traction, which is not something that I want to deal with. So instead, I'm going to be installing the longer shock that was intended for the step side. I've got a pair of these, and they have about 6.5 inches of travel, so I can set this up exactly where Caltracs want it, you know, with because it's 6.5, I'll probably do like 2.25 of available compression, and that'll leave 4.25 of extension. So that'll be perfect. That'll allow for all the separation in the world and all the compression that I should need. But the only problem with installing those longer shocks is now I need to redo my upper brackets, because with the added length of that shock, it would put the bottom bracket like cranked way, way down, and it would even probably hang out lower. I did check it, it would hang out lower than the bottom mount for the Caltracs. So I didn't like how it looked. Luckily, I do have another set, so all I'm gonna do is, you know, chop these guys off here and re-weld the new ones on probably a little bit higher in, you know, I'll try to get about 1.5 inches, 2 inches higher in that range there. So I will buy another set of brackets for the step side, and I'll try to maybe swap out the short shocks for another set of long ones. But a little bit of extra work, not a huge deal. I would much rather get that taken care of now than find out, you know, when we're doing a 1,000-horse launch that we have a problem. So back to work and some more grinding and welding. So I got to admit, this whole job did take me a little bit longer than I was originally anticipating, but I was just able to start the truck up and drive it outside, which makes me really, really happy because I was able to sweep the entire shop floor, and there was so much dirt and dust and rust that had kind of made its way, you know, up front under the truck, places where I actually couldn't sweep. Now, I'm pretty OCD. I like a clean shop, and I sweep the floor like 2 or 3 times a day when I'm doing stuff like this. But I was so happy to be able to push it out, sweep the entire floor. You know, there's those little wire bristles from the wire brush that are everywhere. So I got all those cleaned up. And anyway, this is the finished product, and overall kind of what we've done. We went from a 4-inch drop with shackles and hangers to a roughly 6-inch drop with a flip kit. So we put the original hangers back on. We pulled the leaf springs apart to take away the overload. We pressed in the Caltrac bushing. We have Caltracs installed. We've got a C-notch in the frame. Of course, we painted the entire frame, which took a huge amount of time, but it does look oh so much better. And then of course we did the Atomic Fab double adjustable Viking shock conversion. And I'm glad, even though I did have to do those twice, I'm glad I put the longer shocks in just because it has more travel for riding on the street, which should give us a better ride. And it won't limit the Caltracs from doing what they need to do. So hopefully this should be the final suspension setup, sort of, that we're going to be doing. I did talk to Richard from Atomic. He is going to swap me out for the short shocks for a longer pair so I can put the step side basically looking just like this. In terms of future changes we may make, I'm considering going to a split monoleaf and a slider once we get going a little bit faster, but I do want to see how this works in this exact configuration. In terms of ride height, because this question has come up once or twice in the comments, so we're about 6 inches lower than stock out back, and right now we're at a 2-inch drop technically with just a drop spindle, but this is a pretty big but. We have a huge giant 8.1 in here that weighs, I think, at least 300 or 400 pounds more than the LS, especially considering we got a 50-pound turbo and a big giant intercooler and a bunch of piping up there. So anyway, the front is a little bit lower than a 2-inch drop, and I can't even go lower, to be honest, because these tires, these are 265 60/18s on a 2014 Silverado wheel. They already rub the inner fender well whenever I go over like a big bump, so I can't go any lower up front now, but before it did have a little bit of a rake. The back end was a little bit higher, so I think we're probably about a 4.6 drop, which should be pretty level, but in the future we may lose some weight up front and do some fine tuning on the suspension. Wheels and tires, that's worth mentioning as well. I have brakes on here from a 2009 or 10 Silverado. It's a power stop kit, and they do have a bigger rotor than this truck originally would have had. Normally you can run a 16, but now the minimum wheel I can run without making any changes is a 17. They do have lots of 17-inch drag tires and wheels out there. I think Weld or Raystar are kind of 2 popular ones that I might choose between. But if I decide I want to run a 15-inch wheel, because there are definitely a lot more tire options in the 15-inch range for a drag radial or a true bias ply drag slick or whatever. I don't really know much about drag tires yet. But in order to run a 15, I will have to do a brake conversion, but it's kind of standard stuff when you're building these trucks. That's more or less the finished product, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. I did also, I don't think I mentioned this yet, but I did weld the axle housing to the tube just because I have seen these, like they're plug welded in 2 or 3 spots, and of course they're pressed in, but I have seen the center housings like twist up, which will kind of ruin your day. I do need to add a drive shaft loop at some point, so we're like a major step in the right direction, but we still have quite a bit of work to do before this truck kind of makes its final configuration. Real quick, I know I'm rambling here, but Caltracs need to be adjusted once we have the bed and the bumper and the exhaust back on. But basically what you do is you turn this bar to kind of lengthen it until this little roller right here just barely touches the leaf spring. Depending on the track conditions and a million other variables, you may need to preload that just a little bit. Some guys run a little bit of a gap, like maybe a 16th or an 8th. That will just require some experimentation, as well as the adjustment on the shocks. I know Viking provides this little handy chart that just kind of gives you a rough setup, but we'll play with the compression and rebound adjustments on the shocks once we get to the track. And I very well may have a different setup for like street driving, and I'll just make a few tweaks on the adjusters when we get to the track. Anyway, that's going to bring this video to a close. For the next few videos, we're going to be working on the step side. Again, the other 2000 Silverado, we have one of those guys there. That's going to be one of the first things that we do. And in that box right there, we actually have a different muffler because the one that's on there, I thought I loved it. I don't, so we're swapping that out. Thanks for watching, guys. I do appreciate it. Do me the favor, like, comment, and subscribe. All that stuff helps. Oh, and I'm buying a new